So I'm gonna do a video where I talk about comparing Vegapunk and like punk records and the satellites to One for All from My Hero Academia. Um, so this kind of came about for kind of my thought process for it came about because it was last week or the week before or so, when stuff was revealed about York being the traitor, and then seeing some additional things about like how she interacted with the Seraphim and stuff, that I'm like, well, so we know that all the Vegapunks are connected via punk records and stuff, and that they have like a, at every day they like sync up with it at some point in time, and they download, I guess, any knowledge they discovered or ideas that they've discovered throughout the day. And kind of my thought with that was like, well, I mean, it's not like they're a hive mind, and the fact that like, Lilith was instantly about to, try to attack the Straw Hats when they first showed up, and then Shaka had to talk her down. So just like at that point in time, it's not like Shaka couldn't just immediately like override Lilith and be like, nope, 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 oh, I can't do that. He had to actually call her and talk to her. And then we see other instances, where we've seen other communication where it's like some of it is like instantaneous, like when we see York eating the food, that it seems somewhat instantaneous, that like, oh, the other ones can kind of feel her, can kind of taste what she's eating and stuff like that. So I'm like, okay, well, there's that too. And I'm like, well, I wanted to try to come up with something that was a comparison to that. And I think in the video I said something about, well, it's kind of like One for All when it comes to My Hero Academia and Mizuku and stuff like that, and the fact that all of the One for All has all of the different vestiges inside of it, and they all have their own thoughts and their own memories and everything, but the cumulative power of all of them is One for All itself, is the power of the quirk itself with all of its different facets and everything. So I wanted to do a comparison where I kind of talk about the two of these things. Well, compare and contrast to a degree. Because it's not exactly a one for one, because in comparison, there have been more users of One for All than there have been for the Vegapunk satellites, because there's seven total for the Vegapunks with Stella, and then the 6 satellites, and then for the users, there's been 9 users, from the first one that is like the originator of it, all the way down to Izuku. And I'm like, well, there's a comparison that I can make here. And admittedly, as I said, it's not a one-to-one, but there's a comparison that can be made here. And so the concept that we have when it comes to the Vegapunk satellites, so slight explanation as to the Vegapunk satellites in case anybody watches this video that does not watch One Piece, but knows what One for All is. Or additionally, I'll do one where it's like, well, this is, stuff where I talk about My Hero, but people don't know who Vegapunk is because they don't read One Piece. I don't think I have that much of a cross-section of an audience, so I'm assuming most people know about them, but I'll still do a basic description. But for Vegapunk and the satellites, we know that Dr. Vegapunk, he's 65 years old, and at some point in time in his life, he ate the devil fruit that was called the Nomi Nomi no Mi, the brain fruit. And in that regard, he gained this power that allows his brain to continuously expand indefinitely, with all of this knowledge that he continues to learn. And it becomes like a brains human, is kind of the way that they describe it. And obviously we saw some of the downsides of this. Through the cover story, we saw him, as with Mads and everything, we saw him, we didn't, his brain, his head was not as big as it was when he was at O'Hara and talking with Dragon, and that was 22 years ago. And, by then he'd started was going to go work for the world government. And then even before that, through all of what we saw for the progression of watching, the Mads cover series and everything like that, with watching the different, watching as Vegapunk, grew in notoriety, like, his head literally got bigger. Not in an ego sense of a way, although I would do something along the lines of like, he does have some form of an ego, but it's not as I would definitely say it's a detrimental section of the ego, but I'm not really going to touch on that too much in this, or maybe I will, I don't know. But as as his thirst for knowledge literally go continues, and he reads more books, reads more papers and studies that people have done, does his own research, finds other things and stuff like that, and continues his research, you know his brain grows and grows and grows. And I think it's now stated to currently be like the size of a giant's brain, which at some point in time, I'm sure Vegapunk realized that, well, my brain's getting pretty big. And yeah, his head continuously, gets larger and larger and more, you know, looking like a very top heavy version of an ice cream cone. And it's just like, well, I don't know exactly what's going to happen with that. He could, there's he's got like several different options he can go down. He can go down the option of like, well, I can stop trying to learn things, but that's kind of like it's just like that's not the way Vegapunk is, and so his brain won't get any bigger, but still, you'd still go through life and you'd still learn things, but he can actively try to stop learning all of these new things. And then on top of that, he also could have done the whole thing of like, well, my brain's going to continuously grow, so I can always set myself up in like a really comfortable space where I can like be laying down, pretty much the whole time. But then he's kind of just like in this like vegetative state where he can't really go anywhere. Yeah, his brain will continuously grow as he, reads all the books from O'Hara and everything, but he's not really going to be able to do much with that knowledge. And so he kind of goes down the, as I refer to it, the Dr. Finkelstein route. Dr. Finkelstein is the evil, mad scientist, whatever, from Nightmare Before Christmas. And I made this comparison back when we first were introduced to a bunch of the Vegapunks, and I said, well, what if it was that, Vegapunk literally took his own brain and cut it into pieces and then put it into all of these different satellites? And I wasn't far off. He did cut out his own brain, and then he stuck an antenna in his head, and that looks like an apple. Because, of course, the tree of knowledge of good and evil for a long time was considered to be an apple. That was the fruit there. That's proved wrong. Apples were not around in supposedly were in where the Garden of Eden would have supposedly been. Apples were not around at that point in time in that area, so it probably was a pomegranate, but still. And so that's what that's supposed to represent. And stuck that on his head, and then he put his brain inside of Punk Records. And I'm assuming what is probably like a giant liquid tank of some kind that is designed to like preserve it so it doesn't, rot or get damaged or anything like that from being exposed to the elements. So I'm assuming that's probably there. Inside of Punk Records has, something along those lines. And I don't know if we're ever going to actually like physically see inside of Punk Records. That'll be interesting if it does happen, but one way or the other, I'm not really expecting it to. And what we see happen is, he makes all of the different satellites, and he makes, his 6 satellites, Shaka, Lilith, Edison, Pythagoras, Atlas, and York, and he gives each of them kind of a different personality-ish type trait. Shaka gets good and logic, Lilith is evil, Edison is thinking, flair, that type of a thing, Pythagoras is wisdom, Atlas is wrath or violence, and then of course York is greed or desire. And as of course revealed to us in the last chapters, York is the traitor. She's supposedly been cavorting with the world government and possibly Blackbeard or someone else, depending on it's like, I'll hedge my bets and put some money in both sections and see what happens. And from what we've seen, she wants to be like the only Vegapunk besides the Stella, because then, she can still have access to Punk Records, which can then be useful to whomever she ends up going to work for, goes work for the world government. She can still give them all of this information that Vegapunk has and still knows how to use all of this different technology, because I would also assume that, you can get rid of all the different satellites and Vegapunk himself would probably be fine. But if you get rid of Vegapunk, then the rest of the satellites kind of, they don't have as big of a use, or like they might just shut down because Vegapunk is kind of like the center focal point for where all of this knowledge tends to go, and he is the one that is actually kind of the holder of the devil fruit. Because unless we see one of the other Vegapunks get dropped into the water, and it's like if they took Lilith and like dropped her into the water when she's not petrified, obviously, dropped her into the water, and if she sank, and it's just like, oh no, I can't swim, blah 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 blah, start sinking, then there's two possibilities. Either A, Vegapunk just did not program the satellites with the ability to swim, which I mean that could have been an oversight in his case, or they can't swim either because they are connected to Vegapunk and he has the devil fruit. Which, I mean, like, I guess like a simpler version of that would be like to see if one of those bubbles from the bubble gun that they use against S-Snake, like if that like touched any of the Vegapunks, would that just instantly make them, fall and, lose their power the way that it happened with S-Snake. So that's also a possibility just to see if that would work, but I don't know if that's anything that's going to come up in the chapters or not in the next couple of chapters, but we'll see. Although that would definitely be one way to kind of slow down York, is like if she's affected by that too, then like hit her with a bunch of the bubbles from the bubble gun and, trap her that way. Pin her down that way would be a good way of doing that, depending on stuff. Ideas. But so we know that all of the Vegapunks have access to punk records, and that, as I said, at the end of the day or at some point in the day, they sync all of their information up with punk records and then it downloads it. And I'm like, well, obviously there has to be something that prevents just every single one of their thoughts from ending up there. Otherwise, the other ones would have known that York was going to betray them, that York was in communication with the world government and everything like that. So I'm like, well, there must be a difference between what constitutes knowledge and what just constitutes like their own personalities, or just like, oh, I had this interaction, but it didn't have anything to do with like extending our knowledge or anything like that, so it doesn't need to be uploaded. And I would assume that they would have the ability to choose against that, because it's like, well, maybe they each have like slightly different personal relationships with some of the other scientists that work on the island. And maybe that's not necessarily something like Shaka might have this really good relationship with this person, but maybe, Pythagoras doesn't have a good relationship with the same person. I don't know why, just like maybe they just don't have that good of a relationship with this other person. So it's just like, they don't need to have those conflicting relationships going on. So I don't know exactly what to say about that. But that was kind of my thought. And the comparison for leading into, One for All for this is the fact that all the different vestiges in One for all exist within it at the same time, but all of it is not something that Izuku has access to from the very beginning. So some explanation on One for All. My Hero Academia, they have quirks, which are different powers. Think X-Men from Marvel. Everybody has different powers. Huge chunk of the population, 80% of the population have different powers. Some of them end up being heroes, some of them end up being villains, a good portion of them end up just being civilians. And Izuku Midoriya is this kid who at the beginning of the series, he has no quirk, he has no power, he's one of the 20% of the population that does not have that. And he ends up given this chance by All Might, who is supposed to be the greatest hero that has ever existed. That I will give you my quirk because I have the ability to pass it down to someone. The quirk, part of the quirk's power is the ability to bestow it upon another. And I can give it to you after you train, and I can train you in how to use it. And so the whole first part of the series is Izuku training and getting, get used to the main part of the power, which is him being able to have incredible strength. And what we learn throughout the course of the series is that Izuku is the 9th user, Toshinori, who is All Might, is the 8th user, and there have been, 7 other users before them, all of whom who had quirks of some form or another. And All Might explains to Izuku that the initiator of this quirk, the progenitor of this quirk, was a boy whose name was Yoichi Shigaraki, who was the younger brother of this exceedingly powerful supervillain called All for One. And All for One had the ability to take quirks from people and then either keep them for himself or pass them on to someone else. That was his quirk. And he very much wants to be this, overlording, demon lord, powerful, rule over everything, cause chaos as long as it benefits him. And his brother was supposedly quirkless, so he took this quirk that was a stockpiling quirk and put it into his brother forcefully. And it was revealed later on that the brother found out that he had a quirk of his own that was a rather innocuous quirk that was just called quirk bestowal, which allowed him to pass his quirk on to someone else. And it merged with the stockpiling quirk, and that is where One for All originated. Now, Yuichi wasn't exactly like the most buff character or had the ability to fight or anything like that. For some reason, I remember thinking that there was something where it mentioned that he was like kind of sickly at some point in time, but I could have been wrong about that. And eventually, he's locked away by his brother, and eventually he is found by who end up being the second and third users of One for All, who we still have not gotten names on them yet. But they find him. They are actually kind of rebels or kind of like proto-heroes, vigilantes to a degree that are fighting against One for All. Or fighting against All for One, excuse me. I'll go back and forth on the names, I apologize. They find Yuichi, and they decide to rescue him, and they get him out of his brother's hands. And at some point in time, Yuichi figures out how his quirk works, and he's like, okay, so I can pass this quirk down to one of you, and he's had it for a while, and kind of the way that stockpiling quirks tend to work is over a course of time, they, stockpile power. We've seen this with All Might. We've seen this with Izuku. We've seen a few other different quirks in the series that are stockpiling quirks that you have to, even if someone else copied that power, they don't have the ability to copy the stockpiling section of it. They can't copy the amount of power that has been built up. So we've seen some other characters that have stockpiling type quirks. And One for All is that type of a quirk. And because that is literally the basis of it, of this power to pass on and the stockpiling power. And the second user had the ability that was called Gear Shift. And I haven't figured out, I don't know the exact situation between the first and the second and the third one's quirks, just because I'm still not familiar with them exceedingly. But the way that it describes Gear Shift is it allows the user to alter the speed of anything they touch, allowing them to accelerate the force of a target, either by enhancing the impact force of their own strike or by causing the target to lose control of their own velocity. So you can make something go exceedingly faster, and exceedingly faster, or just make whatever it is touch like lose the power to control their own speed, and then they just go out of control in regards to their speed. Which, at the time when first had that quirk, when the second user first had that quirk, they were probably using it as like a projectile type quirk, speed up the power of other things or speed up their own power and then, attack someone with it. And then add in One for All, and then it adds a stockpiling ability that allows it to get even stronger because it magnifies it more. And then eventually the powers, One for All gets passed down to the third user, and their quirk is called Fa Jin. And that allows the person to build up and store kinetic energy by performing a repetitive movement, and the energy can then be released as an explosive burst of speed and power. That's just like... and Izuku becomes very good at using this in regards to trying to get it to the point where he can actually use his power 100% without actually hurting himself, because that was part of the problem, is he kept hurting himself as he was learning how to use his power before he figured out a better way of moderating the power inside of himself, as opposed to just going full 100% or not having any of it going at all. He had to learn how to, just like modulate how much power he was using. And then the fourth user, Hikage Shinomori, had a quirk that was called Danger Sense. And that just meant that, like, kind of like hockey. I compared it to hockey when I was comparing it to when I was telling my mom about it. It's like kind of like observation hockey, and the fact that it allows you to sense things that are happening around you. You can sense if there's like a villain coming up or a danger or something like that, and that allowed them to use their powers to try to avoid avoid the attack. It acts like a radar, a threat detection system. And then you had the fifth user, Daigoro Banjo, who was called Larian, who had the power called Black Whip, which I explained is like he had the ability to release these black ribbons, tendrils, whatever, out of himself. And he was able to use those to, swing around and wrap around villains and stop them, or, like wrap around people and prevent them from falling, or different things like that. And then there was N, who was the sixth user, whose their quirk was smoke screen. So you can just release, a cloud of smoke. Good for diversions and having dramatic entrances and exits. If you don't want anyone to see who you are. So Batman, I found a good quirk for you. And then the seventh user was Nanashimura, who her quirk was float. And then we had All Might, who I said was quirkless. And then now we have Izuku, who is also quirkless, but he has one for all now. And he also is the first one to actually have access to the ability to use all of the other quirks. And so I was making this comparison of the fact that, like, One for All itself is kind of similar to the way that Punk Records work, and the fact that this, Punk Records is this accumulative amount of knowledge that Vegapunk and his satellites have from the whole 65 years that Vegapunk's been alive, and, however long he's had the devil fruit, because he was a natural born genius, and then he found the devil fruit. So it is a case of, like, the perfect devil fruit finding the person that is best fit to have it. A lot of people make the comparison of like, well, Luffy's the best fit to have the Nika devil fruit. And I'm like, well, Shanks also probably would have been able to use it exceedingly well. And there's probably a few other people that probably would have been able to use it exceedingly well and awaken it too. It's just Luffy happened to be the person that got his hands on it, either through it called to Luffy and he ate it, or whatever the case is. You want to go with that. However you want to go. But, Vegapunk, Punk Records is this accumulative knowledge. And One for All is this accumulated amount of power. That is, yes, the stockpiling quirk, along with every single one of the other quirks passed down inside of it. Because as the person who had the quirk passes it down to their successor, it also passes along their own quirk. Yes, there's residual energy left inside of them, because for the time frame that Izuku was first given the power of One for All Might still had remnants of it inside of him, because he was still able to fight and use his quirk to certain degrees. And then eventually he just kind of used the rest of it all up. And now he's quirkless again. And Izuku is the one that embodies all of it. But for Izuku, he did not have access to everything, everything everywhere all at once. He did not have access to all of that accumulative power. Yes, he had access to a lot of the physical stockpile power, but he did not have access to all of the other quirks. All Might didn't even know that it was possible for a user to be able to access the other quirks that were inside of, One for All. And Izuku figures out that he's able to do this. It happens during different moments of, it starts off as like a moment of desperation, and he's able to activate Black Whip. And then he is then able to eventually learn how to use Float, and then eventually learn how to use, Danger Sense and Fajin and Gear Shift and like all the other ones that are inside of the quirk at the same time. He's learning how to use them, and he is eventually able to like communicate with the vestiges that are inside of the quirk, because they've kind of hinted in My Hero Academia that with the quirks, there's like a piece of the person that remains with it. All for One has also had the same problem, and the fact that he's mentioned that, when I take someone's quirk, whether it's willingly or whether it's unwillingly, when I take someone's quirk, for the time that I have that quirk, occasionally I have dreams or nightmares where I see the person again. And, see them trying to fight against me or whatever it is that he says. And once I give away that quirk, give it to someone else, put it in one of his experiments that are the Nomu, whatever you want to say, once I pass on that power, then I don't have those nightmares anymore. I don't have that ghost following me around. And for Izuku, for One for All, it's a very similar thing in the fact that, like, there are these different vestiges inside of it. There are the other, 8 users all the way up until Izuku. And All Might is the only one that is actually still alive. All the other ones died at some point in battle, either against, All for One himself or against other situations where they ended up dying and they had to pass their quirk on to someone else. And beyond like the first, second, and third users, and then Nana and Toshinori, All Might, they weren't really able to choose who their successor was to a degree. And it's not like they were able to choose someone else who had like this amazing quirk and then be like, oh, well, let's add that to All for One, because to One for All, because they didn't know that that was how it worked exactly. They didn't know that you would then have access to the other stuff. And it's implied that the other users of One for All died fairly soon after they ended up passing on their, quirk to their successor. And, what I wanted to make this comparison is that when it comes to Vegapunk and the, with Punk Records, it's Vegapunk and the satellites all have access to Punk Records. And Vegapunk even said that one of his goals was that he wanted to be able to make it that, like, everyone around the world would be able to have access to Punk Records, so that way they would be able to learn and read and, experience all of these other different things in regards to, like, the different scientific knowledge and just history knowledge and other things like that, and probably arts and other things as well, that are available in the world, because the world and the islands and everything are so isolated that it allows you to learn about all of these different places and things and everything like that. The Wikipedia comparison is not lost on me. That you would be able to have access to all of that, and that other scientists and doctors and, whoever else around the world would be able to then add in their own research to it, and expand on that knowledge even more. So it's this concept of, we all walk around with something like that pretty similar, in our pockets or in our hands or on our wrists or on, in our computers every day. We have access to that in regards to, like, this limited, this unlimited amount of information. And, the Punk Records have that same ability to a degree, depending on stuff. If Vegapunk could, if Vegapunk does find out what happens in the Void Century, blah, 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 however it ends up going, Straw had to take Vegapunk with them onto, the Sunny, and he's with them when they find, Laugh Tale, however that goes, then maybe that would, he would be able to then have all that information, and then they can use, Punk Records, and, once he gets everything all set up for, like, this, distribution all set up around the world, then they can then, broadcast all of that information to everybody else around the world, and then they can learn instantaneously about what happened in the Void Century and with the Ancient Kingdom, and then that would be, a way of taking down the world government, and the fact of, like, you can't stop all of this information at once. You can't even stop a giant bird from publishing a newspaper and distributing that around the world and telling them about what's happening all over the world, telling the citizens about what's happening. Good luck with this once it's all set up and such. Not that they wouldn't try, because I'm quite certain that a lot of them would still try to stop it, but, there's that. And, the comparison is that, yes, Izuku did not have access to all these other quirks and didn't have the ability to talk to every single one of the vestiges all at the same time. It happened over the course of time that he was able to communicate with all of them. And then eventually, now he does have access to all of the quirks and all of the power, but he still has to be careful with how he uses it. And with Vegapunk and Punk Records and all of the satellites, yes, they can all access Punk Records at the same time or at different times or whatever, depending on the certain circumstances, but they all still have their own individual thoughts. They can still hold back knowledge. And clearly that was the case in the fact that York was able to hold back the fact that for the past 3 months, she's been trying to betray Vegapunk. She's been trying to betray him and the other satellites and everything, all for her own gain of trying to become a celestial dragon. And, we saw that, she kept calling Marie Joie, kept calling the world government and being like, hey, I have information here. I'm on Egghead Island. Vegapunk's researching the Void Century and poneglyphs and blah, 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 blah. And there's this giant robot in the basement. And, that's what Vegapunk's been working on. And, there's evidence of it and everything. So you better send some guys to come in, inspect everything. And then that happens, and then they don't find anything, and then they leave, and then either York's the one that captures them, or has one of the Seraphim capture them, depending on certain circumstances, because we don't know exactly how long the Seraphim have been online. But have them capture the different CP agents that keep showing up after they leave, so the other Vegapunks aren't confused as to where they went. They just think some of the sea monsters ate them or whatever. And then, that happens for like 3 times. And then eventually now, Aegis Zero has been sent, and York's like, oh no, I'm going to get, they're here to assassinate all of us. Well, okay. Time for my own version of Among Us, which I've never played and I don't intend to play, but I get the concept. I'm just going to, time for our own little mystery game of who done it. Me, I did it. So, we see all of that. And clearly she was able to hide the fact that she was betraying them from everybody else, from all the rest of the satellites, unless there's another one that's in on it, which is a possibility. Or if there's any of the other scientists that are in on it, that's also a possibility. Then, York would just have her, life of luxury that she wants. But, first she has to figure out how to deal with the Straw Hats and the CP agent, the CP0 agents. And now the world government is on their way with marine ships and a Gorosei and an admiral, possibly a Blackbeard on the way, or someone related in league with Blackbeard is on their way. Really hoping it's Aokiji, and stuff. So it's kind of like a callback to, both Sabaody and O'Hara. In regards to what we're seeing, and to a degree Marineford as well. But I was just trying to make that comparison to the fact that, like, yes, Punk Records is this accumulative amount of knowledge, and One for All is this accumulative amount of power, but, yes, they have their differences, and yes, they are utilized in different ways, but there is that similarity there. And that all of it was not built by just one person. Technically, yes, and the fact that Vegapunk is his own person, and that he is one that built all of the different satellites, but now all the different satellites all have their own personalities and stuff. Yes, they have programming, and clearly York was able to, like, defy parts of those programming, and the fact that she's supposed to be able to, help the other satellites, and the fact that she eats and sleeps and goes to the bathroom for all of them and such. But, as I said, it's kind of this comparison of, like, the overworked, underpaid, overlooked, undervalued employee that is just like, I'm sick of this. I'm going to become the one that's now in charge. So that's what we have. I thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I rambled a little bit at times, but I kind of thought that, like, a lot of that was rather pertinent information. So if you think of a different comparison, then please put it in the comments. So that's what I have. I thank you for watching. I hope you have a nice rest of your day. Bye.